Another day means another sewing project, and in this tutorial I will show you how to sew the festive bow. I think it's just the perfect beginner-friendly pattern and also ideal for the upcoming season. You could, for example, place it on your door or also in your Christmas tree if you have one. And the best part of it is that you really don't need a lot to create it. The only thing you will need is, of course, the fabric. I choose this one. It's a striped one. I think it's super cute and I can't wait to see the final result. And for you, I would also recommend to choose a cotton or maybe a linen, something without stretch to really maintain the shape of the bow nicely. And the other thing you will need is the wadding. I took this one, and then you will need all the basics, such as, of course, your sewing machine, the thread, the bobbin, a seam opener, and so on. So nothing special. And I think that's already it. You will find the pattern, of course, in the description down below. Have a lot of fun and let's start. Grab all of your pattern pieces. Here you can see an overview. First, we have the bow piece, which is, of course, the main piece. Then we have the bow band, which will be wrapped around it. And then we have finally the hanging ribbon, which will be used to hang it up. Once you're ready, you can already grab your fabric. In my case, it's a directional fabric. So here it's important to check in which direction you want to have the motif. For example, here for the bow piece, I check if I prefer to have the lines in the vertical way or in the horizontal way. And I do the same also for the bow band. And for the bow piece, I decided that I would prefer to have them going horizontally. That's also why I need to fold my fabric the other way around. Here you see how I do it. And what's really important if you have a directional fabric is that you pin your fabric first before pinning your pattern to be sure that the motif stay flush. Then we can already proceed with the bow pattern piece. Here it's important that you check where you need to place it. For example, here it's marked on the pattern piece that you need to place it only fold, and we can already cut it out. And I personally love to use an electric scissors. I think you're just saving so much time, but of course you can also use a normal one. Then you can grab your trick marker, or you can also use tailor's chalk, for example, and then we need to transfer all of the notches to our fabric. The notches are the little lines on your fabric which will indicate you where you need to place, for example, later on the bow band, and check out that you are not missing any of them. And here you see how they look on the pattern and then how they should look on the fabric. Then you can proceed and take the paper pattern piece off. And what I like to do is to mark the good side of the fabric with a little pin to be sure that later on you're not confused which one is the right or left side of it. Now we can proceed with the other pattern pieces. Here we'll start with the bow band. I check again how I would like to have the motif. In my case, I prefer when the lines go the vertical way, so that's also why I fold my fabric this way. And what's very important is before placing all the pattern pieces on your fabric is to check how you can arrange them the most efficient way to not throw too much fabric away. This also depends on how wide your fabric runs. Here as well, we will first pin our fabric together to be sure that the motif don't flash, and then we can already pin our bow band on the fabric. Also check first how many times you need it and where you need to place it. In this case, you need to cut it out twice and place it on the fold. And then you can also check the hanging ribbon. You will also need to cut it out twice. So I already placed it on the fabric next to the bow band. Don't forget to mark the notches on the fabric. And once you took the pattern pieces off, think about to insert a pin on the good side of the fabric again. And please do this for all of the pattern pieces. As I told you, I need to have the bow band twice. So here again, I fold my fabric, place the pattern piece on it, and then we can already cut it out a second time. And then one last time, we need to take the pattern piece off and mark the good side of the fabric with a little pin. Now that we cut all of the pattern pieces, we are ready to prepare them for sewing. As you can see, we will first fold the bow band in the middle. Here it's important that the good sides are facing each other. So the sides with the pin should be in the inside. And then we will just need to sew all along of both edges. And then I will repeat the same for the second bow band. Once we did that, we can continue with the bow piece. And here it's very easy. We again fold it right into the middle, good sides facing each other. And then we need to sew all along of the short edge, as you can see here. As a little note, all seam allowance are 1 centimeter in this pattern. Now the moment has finally come and we can proceed to sewing. And what's important here is that you make a few stitches forth and back at the start and at the end of the seam to be sure that the seam is locked. Then we can already cut off the loose threads and we already have our first seam. Once we did that, we can continue with the bow band. As I showed you before, we need to sew all along of these two lines. And here you can see how I do it. So again, a few lock stitches at the beginning, and then I just continue until I reach the edge. And then I stop 1 centimeter before I reach the end turn the fabric around, and then I continue to stitch 1 centimeter from the edge all along. This is how it should look like, and then I'll repeat the same for the other bow band. Now that we made our first seams, we will continue with ironing. I will start with the bow piece. As you can see here, we need to iron this seam open. To do so, open up the seam and run all along of it with the iron. Then we need to pin it together. As you remembered, we have little markings, so here it's important to place the middle of the seam on the middle notch, as you can see here. And then once we did that, we have 2 other notches on the right and on the left of this mark in the middle, and there we will also place a little pin so we know from where to where we need to sew, because we will need to leave this space over here open to be able to insert the bow band. And also note, we only need to insert the bow band on one side of the bow piece and not on both. Here you can see how you need to sew it. So first you start there, then you go all along of this edge, and then you need to stop at your next marking. Leave a little hole right here. We can continue and prepare the bow band. Here I have a little trick to turn them around. So you just place your thumb inside of the fabric, then you fold one edge and then the other edge on top of it, and you hold it with your index, and then you can just push it through the other side of it. And then you just repeat the same with the other side. So again, thumb inside of it, fold one edge around it. Here you only have one, and then push it again through. And then you have a clean edge, and it's easier to have a nice finish. Once you turned everything around, we can continue with ironing. And here it's important that nothing is overlapping and that we have nice clean edges. Let's continue with the ribbon. First, check if the good side is facing down. Then you can use your seam gauge and fold 1 centimeter. Please check in between if you have the right measurements everywhere. And if so, you can proceed with the other side and repeat the same. So again, fold it at 1 centimeter. Check the measurements with your seam gauge and then run over it with your iron. And once you have that, you can see how it looks like over here. And then we need to fold it again in the middle and iron it again. Here you see how the final result should look like. And after this, we need to finish the edges, but only one edge of each ribbon. To do so, grab your scissors and cut both ends diagonally, as you can see in the video. Then you need to open up the left fold and then finally fold it one more time horizontally 1 centimeter down. And then again, fold it in the initial middle, and you can see there is a little pocket. And in this pocket, you need to tuck the other end right in. And then we have a super nice finish, and we only need to top stitch all around of it. Back to the sewing machine, we will start with the bow piece. As I showed you before, we need only to sew from one notch to the end to leave the space in the middle open. Here you can see it a little bit better. So I really only sew from the outer notch to the end, and then I will do the same on the other side. So again, I start at the top, I sew, and then I will stop at the notch so that I really have the opening right in the middle where we will tuck the bow ends in later on. Continue on the bow piece, we just switch it around and then we can sew the other end of it. Here we don't have any opening, so it's really going very quickly, just sewing from one edge to the other one, and then we can cut off the loose threads. Finally, we can continue with the ribbon. Here it's very easy. We only need to top stitch all along of it. I always do it at 1 millimeter from the edge, and also don't forget to adjust the stitch length accordingly. Here you see how I do it. Once I arrive 1 millimeter before the end of the ribbon, I leave my needle in, then I turn the ribbon around. I do a few more stitches to arrive again 1 millimeter from the edge. Then I leave the needle again in, turn it around, and then I can do the final long seam. And of course, you need to repeat the same steps on the next ribbon. So in total, we will have 2 finished ones. And please also note that not both ends look so nice. We only have one finished one. The other one is still raw because it will be inserted in the bow piece, so you will not see it. Here you have the good side of it, and then the other one which will not be visible in the end. Back to the bow piece, we now need to turn it around. So please use the same technique I showed you before for the edges. Put your thumb inside of it, then fold the edge over, hold it with your index, and then turn it around. And do the same for all the 4 edges, and then you can just turn the whole thing around so that you have the good side visible. Now we need to iron again to prepare everything for the next steps. We will start with all of the closed edges. Here again, we check that nothing is overlapping. And once we did that, we can proceed with the opening. Here we will just fold the edge 1 centimeter in to be aligned with the rest of the seam. And we do this because later it will be much easier to sew. In the end, check that everything is leveled and flat, and then we can proceed to the next step, which is to cut out the wadding. I simply take the bow piece, which I put on the wadding, and then I just cut around it. So then you are sure that you have the right size. But of course, you could also take the bow piece pattern and then just take 1 centimeter off for the seam allowance, as we don't need any seam allowance here. Then you just cut all around it. Please be super careful to not cut into your fabric. You could also just contour your piece with a pen and then take the fabric off. This way you would be sure to not cut into your fabric if, for example, you're very clumsy. Depending on how thick and stable your fabric is, you can choose if you want to use 1 layer of wadding or maybe 2. And of course, it also depends on how thick your wadding itself is. So for example, if you have a very thick one, 1 layer would be enough. I only had very thin one at home, so I decided that I want to have 3 layers in, as my fabric is also not very thick. You can also already put it in the bow piece to check how much volume you want to have, or if you want to add even more. This is really up to you, depending on how much volume you want to have in the end. Once we did that, we will continue with the bow band. First, we place them correctly so that we will insert them the right way. To do so, check that the fold of both is next to each other, and then you need to put one on top of the other one. And that's already it. This is how they will be inserted in the hole we have in the bow piece, as you can see here. And to have it easier, we will just tuck the wadding inside of the bow piece away so that we are sure that we will not sew accidentally on it. To place the bow band into the intended space, it's super important to check the notches. The middle bow band notch should be placed on top of the bow piece notch. This way we can ensure that everything is centered and flush in the end. And to make it easy to sew, we will not sew all at once, but do it step by step. Here you can see again how to pin your pieces together, and this is also how we will sew them. The lower bow band lines up with the lower fabric and the upper bow band with the upper fabric. In the end, everything will be joined together. But before we continue, you should decide how you want to place your ribbons, centered or on the right or left side. I personally prefer the centered version because I just think it looks nicer, but the weight of the bow, for example, is better distributed when you place the ribbon on the left and right side. Of course, you could also choose to not insert a ribbon at all and simply thread 1/4 loop later if needed. You can see both options on the screen, the centered version on the right and the other one on the left. For the centered version, we place both ribbons on top of the middle notch, one on the lower fabric and the other one on the upper fabric. For the right and left option, you can place both ribbons on the lower fabric since they will not be layered, and you can position them close to the edge of the bow band. Now we need to pre-stitch everything, and here I will start with the upper fabric. So I'm just stitching at 5 mm from the edge, and this is only to fix the bow band and the ribbon onto the bow piece fabric. Of course, we will repeat the same on the other side, so then we are well prepared to sew everything together. Just as a little tip, make sure you're only sewing 1 layer of fabric together with the bow band and the ribbon. So ensure that the lower layer of fabric is out of the way, because otherwise you might accidentally sew it in and have to undo the seam later. And also please check if the ribbon is placed perpendicular to the edge to achieve a clean and neat finish. Once we are done, we need to close the gap, and to do so, we will fold the bow bands on top of each other and then pin everything together so that everything stays fixed. And I also like to check if the ribbons are as well on top of each other. And then I just pin also the ribbons together. And to be sure that I will really sew through both layers, I like to make a little check. So I push one pin 1 mm from the edge through all the layers, and then I see where it's coming out on the other side. If it's still on the fabric, then it's fine and I can go on to sewing. Now we need to close the gap, and to do this, you need to sew 1 mm from the edge with the sewing machine, only on top of the bow band. So not on the rest, only on this little part. And don't worry, this machine seam won't be visible later, as the bow band will cover it once they're folded down. The remaining openings to the right and left of the bow bands will be closed by hand stitching. And if you're really not comfortable with hand stitching, you can also close the entire gap with the machine. Please be aware that the seam will be visible and that the final result may not look as neat. We are nearly at the end. To continue, we will grab a needle, then we will thread the needle, and then we can proceed to the hand stitching part. First, we do a little knot. I have this technique. Of course, you can also use another technique. Then we go with the needle from the outer to the inside, as seen in the video. This way you can ensure that the knot stays really in the inside of the fabric. And then we always need to take a little part of fabric. So you don't push through the whole fabric, but you really take just a few threads from one side, and then parallel to it, or maybe 1 mm a part of it, you grab the next threads from the other side. And you really need to be very careful to not go through all of it. And also what's important is that you take the threads a little bit more from the inside and not from the edge to be sure that the seam will not be seen. And then I just do it all along of it. Here you can see a bit further how I do it. And then the seam will be nearly invisible. Then you continue to do it until you arrive at the end of the seam. And then we only need to close the threads. So I cut them off and then I just go with one 2 millimeters apart from the other one. I pull it through, then I make a little knot with both together, and then I thread both again into the needle, and then I just go again with the needle through all of the layers and come out a few centimeters apart, and then I just cut it off. After this, you also need to do it on the other side, and then we're already nearly done. Only thing you need to do now is to take the pin from the wadding out, and then you only need to do a knot with the bow bands, as you can see here. Yeah, and then that's already it, and you can see the final result. Let me know in the comments how you like this tutorial and what you want to see next. I really hope you are happy with how the bow turned out, and I'm super excited to share more with you soon and hope to see you in the next one.